I'm Mia, I'm 18, and on the night of my high school graduation, instead of cake, my mother and stepfather sat me down and told me I had to move out by the weekend. When I asked why, on the single best night of my entire senior year, my stepfather said, "We have to think about your sister's future too. You're the strong one, Mia, you'll be fine." They handed me one packed bag. They'd already boxed the rest of my room while I was at the ceremony. I want to tell you what happened in the year after that night. It involves a trust my late father set up before he died, that I didn't know the real size of. A withdrawal labeled with my own initials that had nothing to do with me. A mother who knew more than she ever let on. And a version of protecting my sister that turned out to mean something very different than the sentence made it sound. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the ones who get sent away with a single bag are usually the ones who end up holding everything that actual why matters. If you've ever been told you were strong enough to lose everything without complaint, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. My father, Daniel Holloway, died in a car accident when I was 7. I remember him mostly in fragments now, the smell of sawdust from his woodworking shed, the specific way he hummed off-key doing dishes, a silver watch he wore every day that I still have in a drawer. My mother, Renee, remarried 3 years later to a man named Craig Doyle, who ran a home renovation contracting business that was, depending on the year, either doing fine or doing badly, though nobody in our house ever explained to me which. My half-sister Ellie was born the year I turned 9, and I loved her immediately and completely, the way you love someone you've watched grow up entirely inside your own house. Craig was never outright cruel to me, not in any way I could have pointed to clearly for most of my childhood. It was smaller than that. The way school forms addressed to parent or guardian always seemed to end up in Renee's hands instead of his, the way Ellie's soccer games got circled on the family calendar in a different color than mine ever did, the way we so often quietly meant Craig, Renee, and Ellie, with me existing somewhere just outside the boundary of that word without anyone ever having to say so directly. I told myself for years that I was imagining the edges of it. I wasn't imagining anything. I worked a part-time job at a diner starting the summer I turned 16, mostly for spending money, but also, if I'm honest with myself now, because it gave me somewhere to be that wasn't quite so full of small, careful math about who belonged where. My manager, an older woman named Dot who'd run that diner for 2 decades, used to tell me I worked like someone who thought she had something to prove. She wasn't wrong. I just hadn't yet figured out, back then, who exactly I thought I was proving it to. The spring of my senior year, filling out financial aid paperwork for community college, I asked my mother directly about the trust my father had set up before he died. I remembered vaguely being told as a young kid that there was something for later waiting for me, though nobody had ever discussed specifics. Renee's face did something complicated when I asked, a flicker she smoothed over fast. "We'll sort all that out after graduation, sweetheart. Don't stress about it now." Craig, overhearing from the next room, called out, a little too quickly, "Yeah, let's not put a number on things before we know what's actually there," which struck me, even at the time, as an odd thing to say about money that was supposedly mine to begin with. I let it drop that day, that I brought it up once more, a week later, framing it as a practical question rather than a suspicious one. I just needed to know for the FAFSA form whether there were any assets in my name I needed to report. Renee said she'd do lay check with Craig's accountant and get back to me, which she never actually did, not that week or any week after it. I filled out the form eventually listing the trust as unknown, a small technical lie that bothered me more than it probably should have, given how much bigger a lie I'd eventually learn was sitting underneath it. Over the following weeks I started noticing things I'd apparently trained myself not to notice for a long time. Craig bought a new work truck, cash, no financing, right around the time he'd told Renee at dinner that the business was in a rough patch. Ellie got a car for her upcoming 16th birthday, a nicer one than anything in our driveway had ever been. I asked Renee carefully how the business could afford a truck if things were tight enough that my own college plans kept getting vague, non-committal answers. She said, "Craig handles all that. I don't get into the details," in a tone that told me the conversation was already over before I'd finished asking it. I mentioned the truck to Dot at the diner, one slow Tuesday afternoon, mostly just thinking out loud while wiping down the counter. She'd known our family for years, had watched me grow up coming in for milkshakes with my dad before he died. "Money doesn't lie even when people do," she said, not unkindly, just plainly, the way she said most things. "If there's cash for a truck, and cash for a car, there's cash somewhere for whatever they're telling you there isn't cash for. You just haven't found where it's coming from yet." I didn't think much of that comment at the time beyond appreciating that someone had finally said the quiet part out loud. I'd think about it a great deal more later, once I understood exactly where it had been coming from. Graduation night, I came home still in my cap and gown, genuinely happy for the first time in months, expecting the small family dinner Renee had promised the week before. Instead, Craig and my mother were sitting at the kitchen table, he formal in a way that immediately told me something was wrong before either of them said a word. Craig spoke first. "Mia, we need to talk about your living situation. With Ellie starting her junior year and the business where it's at, we just don't have the space or the resources to keep supporting 2 kids the way things are set up right now." I asked what that meant, exactly, still in my cap and gown, my diploma still in its folder on the counter behind me. "It means you need to find your own place," Craig said. "You're 18 now. You're the strong one, Mia. You'll be fine." My mother didn't correct him. She didn't look at me at all, actually, just stared at a spot on the table like it required all her attention. There was a single packed duffel bag sitting by the front door when I finally understood the conversation was already over. They'd packed it before I got home from my own graduation ceremony. I stood there in my cap and gown for what felt like a very long time, waiting for one of them to say something that would make this make sense, some detail that would turn it back into the kind of hard conversation families sometimes have, rather than the ending it actually was. Ellie appeared in the hallway at some point during that silence, still in her school clothes, looking between the 3 of us with the specific confusion of someone who'd walked into the middle of something she could tell was enormous without understanding any of the actual words being used. "What's going on?" she asked. Craig told her, gently, to go to her room, that the grown-ups needed to finish talking. She looked at me one more time before she went, and I've thought about that look more times than I can count in the months since. Not scared exactly, just uncertain, the look of someone watching the floor of her own house shift under her feet, without yet knowing why. I stayed with my friend Priya's family for the first few weeks, sleeping on a fold-out couch in their den, grateful in a way that had an edge of humiliation to it I couldn't quite shake. I texted my mother twice that first week, careful, measured texts, asking simply whether we could talk. She replied once briefly, "Give it some time, sweetheart. This is hard for everyone." I texted Ellie separately, and got nothing back at all, which I later learned was because Craig had told her, plainly, that I needed space to figure things out, and that texting me too much wouldn't be helpful right now. My 15-year-old sister, who I'd walked to her first day of kindergarten, had been quietly instructed to leave me alone, and she, being 15 and trusting her father, had done exactly that. Priya's mother, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Kavita, never once made me feel like a burden on that fold-out couch, though I felt like one anyway, the way you do when your presence in a space depends entirely on someone else's kindness, rather than your own right to be there. She'd leave plates of food outside the dentist's own nights without saying anything about it, just quietly making sure I'd eaten. I got a second job at a grocery store that summer, stacking shelves overnight, partly for money, and partly because working nights meant I didn't have to lie awake in a stranger's den, running the graduation night conversation on a loop in my head. Dot kept my diner shifts open for me too, told me, when I apologized for needing fewer hours, "You come in when you can, kid. That job's not going anywhere." It was, that whole stretch, the steadiest kindness I had, coming almost entirely from people who weren't legally obligated to give me any of it at all. 3 weeks in, unpacking the single duffel bag properly for the first time, I found, tucked into a side pocket I hadn't checked, an old cigar box I recognized instantly as my father's, small woodworking mementos, a few photographs, and folded at the bottom, a letter on law firm letterhead addressed to my mother, dated the year after my father died, referenced ing the Daniel R. Halloway Trust for the benefit of Mia R. Halloway, and mentioning a scheduled disbursement structure tied to my 18th and 21st birthdays. I had genuinely never seen this letter before. I don't know whether someone packed that cigar box for me deliberately, or whether it simply got swept into my bag by accident during a rushed packing job. Either way, it was the first real evidence I'd ever held that whatever something for later my father had left me was formal, legal, and considerably more specific than I'd ever been told. I sat on Priya's den floor for a long time with that cigar box open in my lap, going through the rest of it slowly, a folded photograph of my father at his workbench, a few carved wooden buttons he'd apparently made as practice pieces, a movie ticket stub from some date night with my mother years before I existed. It was strange holding pieces of a whole life that had ended before I was old enough to understand any of it fully, especially on top of a night that had ended a different chapter of my life, just as abruptly. I remember thinking, reading that attorney's letter a second time, that my father had clearly tried to plan carefully for a future he wouldn't get to see. I didn't yet know how badly that careful planning had actually been handled once he was no longer around to check on it himself. I called the law firm listed on the letterhead the next morning, hands shaking slightly as I dialed. The original attorney had retired years earlier, but a younger partner who'd inherited the file, a woman named Farah Bell, confirmed the trust's existence, and once I verified my identity, agreed to send me what records the firm still held on file. She mentioned, almost offhand, that the trust had originally been funded with a life insurance payout in the mid-six figures, structured to grow over time under my mother's trusteeship, until I turned 18, at which point I gained the legal right to a full accounting and increasing access to the funds. Mid-six figures. I sat in Priya's den with that number turning over in my head, trying to reconcile it with a household that had, for years, described itself as barely getting by, that had just sent me out the door with one bag because there apparently wasn't enough room or money to go around. Farah offered to walk me through what she remembered of the original trust structure, patient with me in a way I badly needed that particular week. She explained that my father had set it up specifically to protect the funds from being casually accessed, structured around age milestones rather than handed over as one lump sum precisely because, she said gently, some parents worry about exactly this kind of situation, even when they're not around to see whether their worry turns out to be justified. I asked her, half joking, half desperate for reassurance, whether that meant my father had somehow anticipated this. She said she couldn't speak to his exact intentio, only that the structure he'd chosen was a common one for parents who wanted their child to have real protection built in, not just good intentions from whoever ended up managing it after they were gone. I requested formal account statements as a named beneficiary, which Farah told me I was legally entitled to receive. What came back 3 weeks later, forwarded from the trust's financial institution, showed a balance far smaller than the number Farah had described. Layered throughout the statements, going back roughly 4 years, were a series of substantial withdrawals categorized vaguely as trustee-approved family expenses, draining the account in increments large enough that the original mid-six-figure sum had shrunk to barely a fraction of what it should have held by the time I turned 18. I laid the withdrawal dates out chronologically on Priya's kitchen table, next to a rough timeline of the years I remembered as tightest around our house. The year Craig mentioned he business struggling, the year Ellie's private middle school tuition had apparently, according to a conversation I half remembered from dinner, worked out easier than expected. The dates lined up closely enough that the pattern stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like something else entirely. I called Priya into the kitchen and spread the pages out for her too, needing a second set of eyes to confirm I wasn't simply seeing what I wanted to see out of hurt and anger. She went quiet for a long time, moving her finger slowly down the list of dates, then looked up at me and said, "Mia, this isn't a maybe, look how neat this is. Every single big withdrawal lines up with something you remember happening in that house. That's not bad luck, that's a pattern somebody built on purpose." Hearing someone outside my own spinning head say it out loud, plainly without hedging, made it feel real in a way that reading the statements alone hadn't quite managed to. I understood, sitting there with those statements spread out in front of me, exactly what the strong one, "You'll be fine," had actually been protecting. It hadn't been protecting Ellie's resources from being split between 2 kids. It had been protecting Craig from a legal deadline. The moment I turned 18, I gained the right to demand a full accounting of a trust he'd apparently been drawing from for years. And removing me from the house, quickly, quietly, right as that birthday landed, meant I'd be too busy surviving to notice, at least for a while, exactly what I was now legally entitled to ask about. I thought about the calendar in our kitchen, Ellie's soccer games circled in a different color than mine ever were, and understood, for the first time, that the unevenness I'd spent years quietly absorbing hadn't just been emotional favoritism. Some of it, apparently, had been paid for. I spent a full evening after that just sitting with the recalculated timeline of my own life, watching old assumptions rearrange themselves one by one. The year Craig had suddenly stopped complaining about the business at dinner, right when I remembered a particularly large withdrawal date. The year Ellie's braces, her club soccer fees, a family vacation I hadn't been included on because I'd had too much summer work to take off, all clustering suspiciously close to other withdrawal dates on the page in front of me. None of it, individually, would have seemed like proof of anything. Laid end to end in order, it stopped looking like a family managing hard times together and started looking like a household quietly running on a fund nobody had ever told me I was allowed to ask about. I called a legal aid clinic that specialized in trust and estate matters for young adults aging out of family financial arrangements, and was connected with an attorney named Doreen Kapoor, who reviewed everything I had, Farah's letter, the account statements, my rough timeline, over a video call from Priya's. She was quiet for a moment, then said the sentence that changed how I understood my own footing in all of it. A trustee has a legal duty to manage trust assets solely for the beneficiary's benefit, not the trustee's own household expenses. If even a fraction of what you're describing holds up, this isn't just an uncomfortable family situation. This is a breach of fiduciary duty, and you have real legal standing to demand full restitution. I'd spent 3 weeks believing I'd been sent away because there simply wasn't enough to go around. For the first time, I understood there might have been plenty. It had just never been going around to me. Doreen asked me to organize everything into a single file before our next call. Farah's letter, the account statements, my own handwritten timeline. I spent a night doing that at Priya's kitchen table, and somewhere in the middle of it, methodically dating and labeling each piece of evidence, I noticed the same strange steadiness Farah's home call had first given me, the specific calm that comes from turning a feeling you've carried alone into a stack of facts other people can independently verify. You've built a stronger record in 3 weeks than some clients manage in months, Doreen told me on our next call, flipping through the file I'd sent over. That's not luck. That's you paying close attention to something everyone around you was hoping you wouldn't. Doreen laid out my options plainly. I could quietly request the funds be released and walk away, hoping Craig would simply comply without further conflict. I could go home, confront my mother and stepfather directly, and give them one chance to make it right before anything became formal. Or I could have Doreen send a formal demand for a complete itemized accounting under state trust law, understanding that once that letter went out, there would be no soft, private version of this conversation left for our family to have. Time I'd seen her before all the texts went unanswered. I thought about the single duffel bag by the front door, already packed before I even got home. I understood, sitting in Priya's den with my laptop still open to the account statements, that whichever path I chose, I couldn't go back to, simply hoping this would quietly sort itself out on its own timeline. I called Dot at the diner the next morning, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud to someone who'd known my father, who might understand what it meant to protect something he'd built, rather than just what it meant to survive the current mess. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she wiped down the counter she didn't need to wipe down, and said, "Your dad built that woodshop out back board by board because he didn't trust anybody else to build it right. I think he'd want you fighting for this the same exact way. It wasn't legal advice. It didn't need to be. It was just permission from someone who'd known him to take this as seriously as it actually deserved." I chose to send the formal demand, and Doreen filed it within the week, a request for a complete itemized accounting of every transaction in the trust since its creation, addressed to Craig as trustee, with a statutory deadline for compliance. I didn't call home to warn them it was coming. I let the letter speak first, the same way a single packed bag by the door had once spoken for my mother and stepfather, without either of them needing to explain themselves to my face. My mother called 4 days later, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard directed at me before. "Mia, we got a letter from a lawyer." "What is this? You're going to drag your family into court over money that was always going to be yours eventually anyway." I told her, calmly, that I was simply requesting information I was legally entitled to as a beneficiary, and asked her, since we were already talking, whether she'd known about the withdrawals. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I could hear a television faintly in the background. "It's complicated, Mia," she finally said. It was the closest thing to an admission I'd get from her that day, and it wouldn't be the last complicated thing she'd eventually have to explain more fully. She called back twice more that same week, each time circling closer to real conversation without ever quite landing on one. The second call, she tried, "Can we just handle this as a family, please, without a lawyer standing between us?" I told her I would have loved nothing more than exactly that conversation, months earlier, on graduation night, before a packed duffel bag had already made the terms of this discussion for both of us. She didn't have a response to that. I didn't expect one by that point. The accountant arrived 6 weeks later, after 2 missed deadlines and 1 extension request from Craig's attorney. It ran to nearly 20 pages, and buried among legitimate early expenses from years earlier were entries that immediately stood out. Several withdrawals justified with receipts for MH school trips, MH clothing and personal items, and 1 substantial line item labeled MH tuition deposit, dated the same summer Ellie had started at a private middle school I had never once attended myself. I stared at that line for a long time. MH, my initials, attached to a tuition deposit for a school I had never set foot in. I called Doreen immediately, and she agreed it warranted a closer look before we assumed anything. But even reading it cold, sitting at Priya's kitchen table with the accounting spread across 2 chairs, I already suspected exactly what a closer look was going to confirm. I went through the remaining pages, line by line, that same night, unable to stop once I'd started, cross-referencing every vague MH entry against anything I could actually remember receiving during those years. A clothing and personal. M's withdrawal from a year I remembered wearing the same 3 pairs of jeans on rotation because money was supposedly too tight for new ones. A school trip withdrawal from a year I hadn't gone on any school trip at all, having stayed home instead because I couldn't afford the deposit, and nobody had offered to help cover it. Reading my own life against a paper trail claiming to have funded parts of it, I distinctly remembered going without, was one of the strangest, most disorienting experiences of that entire year, like reading a biography of myself that had been quietly, deliberately rewritten by somebody else. Doreen brought in a forensic accountant to trace the tuition deposit and several of the other vaguely justified withdrawals directly to their actual destinations, rather than relying on Craig's own labeling. The trail led cleanly to Ellie's private school enrollment records, and for 2 of the larger withdrawals, directly into Craig's business operating account during the CT period. He'd described the business as struggling. The MH on the tuition deposit, it turned out, hadn't been an abbreviation of my name at all in the school's own records. It had simply been how Craig's bookkeeper, working from his verbal instructions, had logged an MH trust disbursement, technically accurate as a funding source, and functionally invisible as a description of who the money had actually gone to help. This wasn't disorganized bookkeeping anymore. This was years of deliberate, low-visibility misappropriation, dressed up in labels vague enough to survive a casual glance, and specific enough, I now understood, to survive years of me never once being shown the actual statements. The forensic accountant, a careful, unhurried woman named Pretty, who Doreen brought in specifically for her experience with family trust disputes, walked me through her findings over a call that lasted nearly 2 hours. She showed me, screen share by screen share, how the MH trust notity on had originated purely as an internal shorthand in Craig's own bookkeeping software, used consistently enough across years of entries that it had clearly become habit, rather than a one-time slip. This is the kind of pattern I see in cases where someone convinces themselves they're just borrowing, Pretty said, right up until the borrowing becomes the entire foundation of how the household actually functions. Hearing a stranger describe my own family's finances with that much clinical precision was its own particular kind of gut punch, separate from the numbers themselves. I called my mother again, not Craig, because I needed one honest conversation with someone in that house before this went any further. She started crying almost immediately once I read her the forensic accountant's findings. "I found out about the tuition deposit 2 years ago," she said. "I confronted Craig. He promised he'd pay it back before you ever needed the money, said the business just needed a little more time to recover. I believed him, or maybe I just wanted to, because the alternative was admitting our whole life together was built partly on something I couldn't undo. I asked her whether that was why they'd sent me away so quickly right at 18. She was quiet a long moment, then said, "I think Craig panicked the moment he realized you'd have the legal right to actually look at those statements. I told myself we were giving you room to become independent. I think some part of me always knew that wasn't the whole truth." Hearing her admit it didn't erase the single duffel bag by the door, it just gave that bag, finally, an honest explanation instead of the one I'd been handed on my graduation night. "I want you to understand something," she said, near the end of that call, her voice steadier than it had been the whole conversation. "I didn't help pack that bag because I wanted you gone, Mia. I helped because Craig told me it would be easier for everyone if it happened fast, before it turned into a bigger fight. And I was scared enough of losing the whole family that I let easier win over right. I've hated myself for that decision every single day since." I told her I believed she regretted it now. I also told her, as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that regretting it now didn't undo what it had cost me to live through it then, and that both of those things could be true about her at the same time. With the forensic findings confirmed, and my mother's account corroborating years of knowledge, Doreen filed a formal breach of fiduciary duty claim against Craig as trustee, seeking full restitution of the misappropriated funds plus statutory interest, along with his removal as trustee and appointment of a neutral successor. It was a serious step, and I understood, signing the claim, that whatever fragile, distant relationship remained between our households was about to become considerably more complicated, permanently, in a way no holiday dinner was going to smooth back over. Craig's attorney requested mediation rather than a contested hearing, which Doreen recommended I accept, mostly because a negotiated settlement could return the funds faster, and with less erosion to what was left of the family than a drawn-out court battle. I agreed, not because I'd softened toward what he'd done, but because some part of me still wanted Ellie, eventually, to have a version of this story that didn't require her father facing the harshest possible outcome, even if he'd more than earned scrutiny for what he'd done to me. Mediation happened on a gray Tuesday morning, 6 months after graduation night, in a conference room neither of us had ever imagined we'd end up sitting in together. My mother arrived pale, hands unsteady. Craig sat across the table, avoiding my eyes for most of the first half-hour. Ellie wasn't there. She was still a minor. Still, as far as I knew, mostly unaware of the actual mechanics of what had happened, which felt, in hat room, like its own small mercy. Craig reached first for the version where the withdrawals had simply been temporary, always intended to be repaid, where the tuition deposit had been a rounding error in a complicated system, nothing deliberate. I asked him evenly whether sending me out the door with one bag, 4 days before his own accounting deadline would have kicked in, had I stayed and asked questions in person, had also just been a coincidence of timing. He didn't have an answer that survived being said out loud in that room. My mother quietly finally said the thing I'd needed to hear from her for months. "It wasn't a coincidence, Craig. We both know it wasn't." The mediator asked Craig directly, at one point, why he'd chosen "you're the strong one" specifically, out of every sentence available to him that night, to explain sending his stepdaughter out the door with one bag. "Now," he said, "you'd always figured things out on your own, Mia, ever since you were a kid. I told myself that meant you could handle this too. I understand now that being able to handle something and deserving to have to handle it are two completely different things, and I used the first one as an excuse to avoid the second." It wasn't a full apology. It was, at least, the first time he'd ever described his own reasoning to me honestly, instead of simply handing me its consequences and calling it strength. The mediator laid out the practical path forward once the personal admissions settled. Craig would be formally removed as trustee, replaced by a neutral corporate trustee, the misappropriated funds, plus statutory interest, would be repaid on a structured schedule secured against business assets and home equity, and the remaining trust balance, along with the restored amount, would be released to me under the new trustee's oversight, finally under terms my father had actually intended when he set the whole thing up in the first place. I didn't push for criminal fraud charges against Craig, though Doreen confirmed I had standing to pursue that path if I chose to. What I wanted most, sitting in that mediation room, wasn't to watch Ellie's father face prosecution. It was simply for the truth to exist somewhere permanent and undeniable, on the record, where it could never again be quietly rewritten into a story about protecting my sister's future at my expense. The settlement agreement, once finalized, ran to a handful of pages, plain and procedural, in a way that felt almost anticlimactic given everything it had taken to arrive at it. A structured repayment schedule, secured against Craig's business assets, and a portion of the home's equity. A new corporate trustee to oversee what remained of the fund going forward. A formal, written acknowledgement of the misappropriation, filed and dated, existing now in a place no one could quietly talk their way around ever again. Green handed me my copy outside the mediation office, and I stood there in the parking lot a long moment just holding it, thinking about how strange it was that a stack of dry legal language could feel like the first thing in this entire ordeal that had ever actually belonged to me without conditions attached. Rebuilding what was left cost real things, months of instability, a community college semester I started while technically homeless, a version of my relationship with my mother and Craig that will likely never return to whatever fragile shape it held before graduation night. I don't regret pursuing the accounting. I understand now that the version of me who might have quietly accepted, "You're the strong one, you'll be fine," as the whole explanation, who might have told herself the number simply wasn't worth the conflict, would have been protecting a peace that was never actually fair to protect, built on money that was legally entirely mine. I think often about my father's watch in my drawer, still keeping decent time after all these years. He set that trust up because he understood, even from the very end of a life cut short, that I might someday need something solid to stand on that nobody else could quietly redirect. I understand now, better than I did at 18 with one duffel bag by a front door, exactly how right he was to plan for precisely that. There's a particular kind of loneliness in fighting for something your own family insisted to your face didn't exist or didn't matter, and I don't think that loneliness ever fully leaves you, even once the paperwork is settled and the money is finally rightfully sitting where it should have been the whole time. Some nights that whole year, working overnight shelving groceries, I'd catch myself doing the math on how differently things might have gone if Craig had simply told me the truth from the beginning, instead of building 4 years of careful mislabeling around avoiding it. I don't have a satisfying answer for that particular math. I've mostly made peace with not needing one. Ellie found out most of the real story about a year later, old enough by then that Renee finally sat her down and explained it honestly, without softening it for either of our sakes. She called me the same week, crying, apologizing for texts she'd never sent back, explaining that she hadn't understood, at 15, that staying quiet had ever cost me anything real. I told her none of it had ever been her fault, that a 15-year-old trusting her father wasn't a crime, and that I'd never once blamed her for any of it, not for a single day of that whole difficult year. It's been almost 2 years now. I'm at university, properly, tuition and housing covered the way my father actually intended, my degree on track, in a way it never would have been on a duffel bag and a fold-out couch alone. Craig completed the first 2 years of his restitution schedule on time, which Doreen tells me is more than she expected. Ted going in. My mother and I talk regularly now, careful, still rebuilding, but honest in a way we never quite managed before graduation night forced the issue. Ellie visits me on campus sometimes, and last spring, digging through an old box of my father's things I finally have proper space to unpack completely, I found a second photograph I'd never seen before. Him teaching 7-year-old me to use a hand plane in his woodworking shed, both of us laughing at something the camera never caught. I keep it on my desk now, right next to his watch, the two things from that life that survived everything that came after it. Dot still keeps a booth open for me at the diner whenever I'm back in town, still tells anyone who will listen that I work like someone with something to prove, though these days I think she means it as more of a compliment than a warning. Priya and I are still close, closer maybe than we were even before that fold-out couch, the kind of close that only really forms once. Hermione has watched you at your most unmoored and stayed anyway. I don't know exactly what my father would make of everything that happened after he was gone. I like to think, watching me finally sitting in a proper dorm room with tuition paid and both his photographs on my desk, that he'd recognize the ending as something closer to what he'd actually intended all along. That's my story. One packed bag, one misappropriated trust, and a family finally telling the truth about which one of us was actually strong enough to carry it. If this reminded you that being called strong is sometimes just another way of being left to handle something alone, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever been sent away and told they'd be fine. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.